I returned to my hometown, filled with a swirl of emotions. This little corner of the world where I had spent my childhood felt both familiar and alien. Everything appeared just as it had always been: the old streets, the park with its fountain where my friends and I would gather in the evenings during our youth, and the enticing aroma of fresh pastries wafting from the bakery on the corner. Yet something felt different. Maybe it was me, transformed by the years I had spent away. Or perhaps the town itself had become unfamiliar to me. My father, Harrison, welcomed me with open arms. Although he was getting older, he remained lively and energetic. He was genuinely happy to see me again, and I felt glad to see him too. Still, I couldn't shake a peculiar feeling deep within me. Then I met her, Lila. She was standing in the doorway of the house, her head tilted slightly to one side as I walked in. Though she was younger than my father, the passage of time had left its marks on her face too. She greeted me with a warm smile, her eyes radiating a warmth I didn't expect from someone I hardly knew. She extended her hand, and I felt her warm palm in mine. The touch lingered a moment too long, making me hold my breath before I quickly withdrew my hand, trying to mask my discomfort. From the very beginning, Lila showed me an incredible amount of care. She constantly checked in on how I was feeling, what I needed, and how she could assist. While it was certainly pleasant, it felt somewhat excessive. She would come into my room under various pretenses, to bring fresh towels, to tidy something trivial, or just to see if I was okay. Occasionally, she'd bring me a cup of tea, lingering a bit longer than what polite company warranted. I tried to convince myself it was just kindness and a desire to help, yet I still felt a twinge of unease. Every day, I noticed her presence becoming increasingly intrusive. She often appeared in unexpected places, like the kitchen while I was making breakfast or the garden when I stepped out for some fresh air to clear my thoughts. She would claim she simply enjoyed spending time together, wanting to get to know me better. However, her words came off as too insistent, almost too sincere. One evening she suggested we play some board games. I agreed, hoping to distract myself from my swirling thoughts and enjoy some company. We laughed and discussed trivial matters, but I couldn't help but notice how she observed me closely, as if she were trying to decipher something hidden in my words. Her gaze felt warm, but there was something else in it, a quality that quickened my heartbeat. It was an emotion I couldn't quite grasp, yet it settled deep within me, fostering a vague sense of unease. I felt as if I glimpsed something in her eyes that shouldn't have been there. These feelings troubled me more with each passing day, leaving me uncertain about what lay ahead. Days slipped by as I attempted to avoid fixating on my thoughts about Lila. Perhaps it was all just the product of stress from relocating. I reassured myself that I needed to acclimate to this new reality, these new relationships, and the evolving dynamics. One gloomy morning, I decided to spend some time in the library. It was one of the coziest spots in the house. Tall wooden shelves brimming with books created an atmosphere of calm and seclusion. Soft light filtered through the old window panes, casting a gentle glow throughout the room. I was searching for a history book, hoping to distract myself and focus on something specific to push away the unnecessary thoughts. Lila appeared unexpectedly, as she always did. She entered quietly, as if she didn't want to interrupt me, yet I immediately sensed her presence. Cradling a cup of tea in her hands, she smiled and said, "Hi, Ethan. I saw you went to the library and thought you might like some tea." I returned her smile, accepted the cup, and thanked her. She lingered nearby, as if she had no intention of leaving. "Are you looking for something?" she inquired. Her interest piqued as she glanced at the bookshelves. "Yes," I replied. "I'm looking for a history book. It should be around here somewhere." Lila moved closer, rising onto her tiptoes to reach the top shelf. I noticed her body lean forward slightly, which made me feel a bit self-conscious, as if she were deliberately trying to catch my attention. "Let me help," I offered, aiming to ease the tension. I moved the ladder to the shelf and climbed up to retrieve the book. As I turned to step down, I found Lila uncomfortably close to me, so close that I could feel her breath on my cheek. Her eyes were locked onto mine as she reached out a hand to steady me, even though it wasn't necessary. And then everything seemed to slow down. She stepped closer, and her lips brushed against mine for a fleeting moment. The kiss was brief but enough to make my heart race, as if it were trying to break free from my chest. I quickly pulled away, feeling a blush creeping onto my face. An awkward tension enveloped the room, the air thick with heavy emotions that felt ready to explode. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her expression shifting to one of embarrassment and confusion. Her gaze lingered on my face, revealing something in her eyes that unsettled me. "It's nothing," I replied, my cheeks burning with shame. "It was probably just a misunderstanding," I reassured myself. She nodded, but I caught a flicker in her eyes that suggested something deeper, as if she had hoped for a different outcome or anticipated a different response. It felt as though the kiss hadn't been a mere accident but rather something that was meant to happen. I hurried out of the library, my legs shaking beneath me. My heart raced so loudly that it felt like it might burst from my chest. I couldn't quite grasp what had just transpired, but one thing was certain. Everything between us had just become much more complicated. After that moment in the library, everything shifted. It seemed like nothing significant had occurred. Just a random, inappropriate kiss that should have been brushed aside. Yet, moving on proved to be much harder than I had anticipated. I tried to steer clear of Lila. I began waking up earlier, leaving the house while she was still asleep, and returning late, making sure to avoid crossing paths with her. However, every time I passed her room or heard her footsteps in the hallway, my heart would tighten. My mind was plagued with endless questions. Why? Why did she do it? Why couldn't I simply look away, ignore it, or pretend it hadn't happened? Still, Lila either remained oblivious to my discomfort or chose to ignore it. She continued to smile at me as before, but her smile carried a new layer, something mysterious and slightly mocking. It was as if she realized I couldn't ignore her, that I was constantly consumed by thoughts of what had transpired. Every day she found a way to be near me. Sometimes she needed clarification about my father's work, while other times, she asked for help with shopping or requested that I accompany her to the nearby store. When I agreed, she bombarded me with questions about my life at university, the friends I had left behind, and my plans for the future. I felt her interest in my life was unnaturally intense, as if she was striving to learn more about me than I was willing to share. One evening after a long day at work, I returned home late to find a note on the kitchen table. "I miss your company." Confusion and bewilderment washed over me. What could she possibly mean by that? Was it just a friendly gesture? An attempt to build a relationship? Or something deeper? I initially decided to toss the note away, but at the last moment, I changed my mind and slipped it into my trouser pocket. Another week flew by, and during that time, it felt as though something was suspended in the air, an invisible thread connecting us. One morning, while I was preparing breakfast, Lila entered the kitchen. Dressed in her usual casual attire, I couldn't help but notice the way she looked at me. "How are you?" she asked casually. "Fine," I replied, making an effort to avoid her gaze. "Just work, home. Nothing new." "You look tired," she observed, stepping closer. "Maybe you should take a break. Sometimes it's good to pause and relax." Her proximity made me uneasy, and I had nowhere to retreat. I had to look up and met her gaze, which held that same strange, persistent interest. "Yes, maybe," I muttered, attempting to mask my anxiety. "It's just been a bit of a tense week." She smiled, as though she heard more than I intended to convey, and leaned in slightly, as if about to share a secret. "If you ever feel like talking, I'm always here," she said softly. I nodded, but inside I felt a tightening. I was uncertain of her intentions, but it was clear that the game had only just begun. I sensed that her words and actions were far from accidental. She was observing my reactions, pushing the boundaries to see how far she could go. I struggled to understand what she wanted, but the answers eluded me, leaving me completely bewildered. Each day I felt increasingly like a mouse trapped in a cage. Lila seemed to relish my confusion. Her interest in me didn't wane. In fact, it became more pronounced. I was on edge, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: fear, desire, and the urge to flee. With each passing day, the game escalated, and the tension became unbearable. Another week went by, yet the situation showed no signs of easing. I attempted to concentrate on work, convincing myself that all these thoughts were merely products of my imagination. However, every encounter with Lila stirred feelings in me that were hard to shake. One evening, after deciding to take a walk in the garden to clear my mind, she appeared beside me once more. As I stepped onto the path, Lila emerged from behind an old oak tree, as if she had been waiting for me. She smiled, though there was an unreadable concern in her eyes. "Hi, Ethan," she said, moving closer. "I thought you might want some fresh air. You've hardly been out of the house lately." I nodded at a loss for words. We strolled silently along the stone path leading to an old gazebo, hidden in the thick shade of the trees. An unsettling feeling nagged at me, as if we were approaching something that had been brewing for a long time. Something inevitable that awaited us at the gazebo. She stopped and turned to me, her expression serious. "Ethan," she said softly. "I feel like something is wrong between us," I began, wanting to clear the air. "I don't want this tension to hang over us like a fog. We need to talk to sort things out." I stood there, frozen, the tension tightening my shoulders. Deep down, I knew this conversation was unavoidable. There was no use in trying to dodge it. Taking a deep breath, I nodded, bracing myself for what was about to unfold. "I feel something more for you than just affection," Lila continued, her voice quivering though determination shone in her eyes. "I know it's wrong, that I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't deny it. Since you returned, I've felt emotions I haven't experienced in a long time. Life has regained its color." I stayed silent, struggling to understand the implications of her words. I didn't know how to respond, but every part of me resisted. This was wrong. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to establish boundaries, to protect myself. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," I stammered, my heart racing. "You know this is inappropriate." She maintained her intense gaze, refusing to break eye contact. Her expression deepened, tinged with anxiety. "I know this shouldn't have happened," she whispered, moving closer to me. "But I can't change it. I thought I could control my feelings, that they would pass." She trailed off, seemingly unable to find the right words. Just as I was about to say something, she leaned in, and before I could process what was happening, her lips brushed against mine. This kiss was long and deliberate, filled with intention. I froze, feeling paralyzed, yet I couldn't look away or pull back. Her lips were warm, and in that moment, deep inside, I felt my resistance beginning to dissolve. This kiss felt entirely different from the one in the library. It was no longer brief and accidental. It was purposeful. It was as if Lila was trying to communicate all the longing, all the unsaid words. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that I had to stop it. But my body didn't listen. For a fleeting moment I surrendered, allowing myself to forget everything else and simply feel her closeness. But then reality crashed back in. I jerked away sharply, stepping back, panic rising in my chest. "No, Lila," I said with difficulty, my breath coming in heaves. "We can't do this. It's wrong. You're my father's wife." She froze, her gaze unwavering. I saw a mix of pain and hope in her eyes. "I know, Ethan," she whispered, "but I can't keep pretending I feel nothing." At that moment I realized there was no turning back. We had crossed a line, and the consequences of this mistake were already starting to build up, ready to come crashing down upon us. After our conversation in the garden, everything shifted. I tried to return to my previous routine, but her words and that kiss lingered in my mind, refusing to fade. I kept telling myself I had to maintain my distance. But the house, once a quiet refuge, had transformed into a labyrinth with no escape. Though Lila didn't bring up her feelings again, her presence was everywhere. It felt as if she was intentionally leaving traces behind. A coffee cup on the kitchen counter, her scarf casually draped over the hallway rack, and her scent lingering like a delicate thread woven into the fabric of the house. I began to feel ensnared, trapped in this situation and in her web. I decided I had to confront her. I needed to make it clear that there could be nothing between us and that we needed to set firm boundaries. So one evening, while my father was still at work, I found Lila sitting in the living room, seemingly waiting for me. Her gaze was fixed on the flickering fire in the fireplace. "We need to talk," I said, striving to sound confident and resolute. She looked up, and in her eyes, I saw a blend of anxiety and anticipation. "About what?" she asked quietly. I sighed and settled into a chair across from her. "I think things have gone too far. We both know that there shouldn't be any feelings between us. It's wrong, and I can't allow this to continue. We need to keep our distance." Her eyes clouded, but she nodded. "Yes, you're right," she said, though her voice sounded more like a murmur to herself than a response to me. "I know this is wrong, but I can't just shut off my feelings, Ethan. They're real and they're there. This all has to stop," I insisted, feeling my nerves fraying. If we keep going like this, it will destroy everything. I can't allow that, for my father's sake, for all of us. For a moment she closed her eyes, seemingly fighting back tears. But when she opened them again, determination filled her gaze. Okay, she finally replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll try, but please understand, I just need time. I nodded, relieved. This was exactly what was needed to establish boundaries and end this precarious situation. Yet, as the days rolled by, nothing changed. I continued to avoid her, leaving for work early and staying out late, but every time I returned home, her presence weighed heavily on me. Her glances grew more intense, her smiles less noticeable. She no longer mentioned her feelings, but her silence was more deafening than any words could have been. She began to find subtle ways to stay close to me, often asking for help in the garden, claiming her back was sore. One evening, after a particularly long and tiring day, I returned home to discover she had made my favorite dish and invited me to join her for dinner. I wanted to say no, but guilt weighed heavily on me, and I reluctantly accepted. We ate in silence, but I could feel her gaze penetrating me. Her calm demeanor and assuredness made the silence even more unbearable. Why do you keep staring at me like that? I finally snapped. I'm just trying to understand you, she replied, her eyes locked onto mine. Why are you so afraid of your feelings? Setting my fork down, I felt a surge of emotion bubbling inside. Lila, I'm not afraid. I just know this is wrong. You're married to my father. She smiled, yet there was a hint of bitterness underlying it. Is that really all that bothers you? I wanted to retort, but the words caught in my throat. Anxiety began to fester within me, turning everything into a game I never wanted to play. Yet here I was, trapped. Panic gripped me tighter. The next day I tried to speak with my father, hoping he might have noticed something odd, but he was so engrossed in his work that he barely registered what was happening at home. He didn't even seem to recognize how Lila had begun acting more aloof, sometimes throwing glances my way that felt like daggers. I found myself contemplating leaving, escaping this entire situation, yet something kept me rooted in place. Perhaps it was a foolish hope that things could still be resolved, but each passing day only exacerbated the tension, leaving me feeling cornered with no exit. Days passed since that uncomfortable dinner, but the tension remained thick, intensifying with every moment, like a storm cloud looming ominously overhead. I felt an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders, as if the walls were closing in, leaving me with no space to breathe. Lila no longer attempted to discuss her feelings, but her presence lingered even when she wasn't there, filling every corner and shadow of the house. One night when I came home late, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The living room light was on, and muffled voices floated through the air. I slowed my steps, straining to identify who was there. As I stepped into the room, dread settled in my stomach. My father, Harrison, was seated on the couch, gripping a piece of paper in his hands. His face was expressionless, cold, and his eyes bore into mine. What's going on? I asked, doing my best to suppress the anxiety rising within me. Ethan, he replied, his tone lacking the warmth and fatherly affection I was used to. Can you explain this to me? He raised the piece of paper, and I recognized it as one of Lila's notes she had left for me. My heart dropped. Dad, it's not what you think, I stammered, scrambling for the right words. It's a misunderstanding. Nothing happened. I promise it's all just a misunderstanding. He cut me off, his voice rising in anger. What nonsense are you spouting? Lila told me everything. What did she tell you? I questioned, my hands shaking. At that moment, Lila walked into the room. Her face wore a blend of concern and confidence. She approached my father and placed a hand on his shoulder, as if to calm him. Harrison, let's not jump to conclusions, she said softly. Ethan misunderstood our intentions. I was just trying to be kind, but it seems he took it the wrong way. I stood there, stunned, as if I had been doused in ice water. She had flipped the entire situation on its head, portraying me as the guilty one. Her words sounded so persuasive and calm that I found myself doubting what had actually occurred. That's not true. I yelled, unable to contain my frustration any longer. She was the one leaving me notes. She kissed me. Lila shook her head, her demeanor still composed. Her eyes were filled with a quiet sadness. Ethan, I understand you're confused, she said softly, almost condescendingly. "I didn't intend for this to go so far. I just wanted to be a part of your life, to be included. Seems you interpreted it differently." I saw a flicker of doubt in my father's eyes, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a stern look as unyielding as stone. "You need to leave this house immediately," he said, his voice icy and firm. "I don't know what's been happening here, but I will not tolerate anyone undermining our marriage or our family." I wanted to protest, to explain everything to him, but the words lodged in my throat. The weight of Lila's and my father's gazes felt unbearable, and I realized there was nothing more I could do. My attempts to maintain distance and set boundaries had all been futile. I retreated to my room, trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. I began to pack my belongings, hastily tossing them into a suitcase, my hands shaking with each movement. My mind was racing with disbelief over how everything had unraveled. I couldn't believe that Lila, the woman I had trusted, could so easily distort the reality of our situation. When I finally left the house, the night enveloped me in darkness, the sky thick with clouds. A cold wind whipped across my face, but I barely felt it. It was as if I were on an alien planet, everything around me transformed into something hostile and unrecognizable. I had lost everything: my home, my father's trust, my place in the world. Rumors had already begun to spread. Soon my entire life would spiral into chaos. Lila remained with my father, and it seemed they continued on as if nothing had occurred. Meanwhile, I was left alone, isolated and rejected, consumed by feelings of betrayal and despair. The life I had known was gone, and I couldn't fathom how to move forward, how to exist in a world where everything that mattered had collapsed in an instant.